When the storm hit St. Anne's, Dr. Sarah Mitchell was faced with a choice that would change everything. A life hung in the balance, a homeless man, with no ID, no insurance, and no hope. But Sarah's decision to operate without approval would spark a chain of events that stunned the entire hospital board. What happens when a doctor's duty to save lives clashes with the rules? And what if the man she saved wasn't who they thought he was? The rain hammered against the windows of St. Anne's Hospital, a relentless rhythm that echoed the urgency within the emergency room. It was past midnight, and the city outside was still, save for the occasional wail of a siren or the distant rumble of thunder. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, head of surgery, was wrapping up a grueling double shift when her pager buzzed against her hip. She glanced down, feeling a familiar pang of exhaustion. "Emergency surgery, or 3, the message read. So much for going home. Sarah ran a hand through her short, dark hair, attempting to ease the tension that had settled at her temples. The hospital was understaffed tonight, as it often was during storms like this. Most people stayed home, leaving the emergency department eerily quiet. But the quiet only intensified the few emergencies that did come through, making them feel even more urgent. She headed toward the operating room, her mind already shifting into the focused state that surgery required. This was where Sarah thrived, where the rest of her life faded into the background. The moment she stepped into her 3, she was no longer the tired doctor who had been on her feet for over 20 hours. She was a surgeon, ready to do what she did best. "Who's the patient?" she asked as she scrubbed in, her voice steady despite the fatigue tugging at her consciousness. "A John Doe," replied Nurse Clara, her tone calm but with a hint of concern in her eyes. Clara had been Sarah's right hand in the OR for years. "No ID, no insurance, nothing. Found unconscious in an alley downtown. Paramedics think he was attacked." Sarah's hands paused for a fraction of a second before she resumed scrubbing. "How bad is it?" "Multiple stab wounds to the abdomen, severe blood loss, possible internal bleeding. He's critical." Sarah nodded, processing the information. A homeless man, no ID, no insurance. Hospital policy was clear: such cases required administrative approval before any non-emergency procedures. But Sarah knew that by the time the paperwork was done, this man could be dead. "Let's get started," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Dr. Mitchell, you know the rules," one of the younger residents began, his voice hesitant. "I know the rules," Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp. "And I know this man will die if we don't act now. We're here to save lives, not debate policies." The resident swallowed hard and nodded, falling silent. The tension in the room was palpable, but Sarah couldn't afford to address it. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not when a life was on the line. The doors to the OR swung open, and the paramedics wheeled in the patient. He was thin, his face gaunt and lined with the hardships of a life lived on the streets. Blood soaked the sheets beneath him, and his skin had taken on a pale, bluish hue. Something about his face tugged at Sarah's memory, a sense of familiarity she couldn't place. But there was no time to dwell on it. His life hung in the balance. "Clara, full trauma assessment," Sarah ordered, moving quickly to the man's side. As Nurse Clara worked, Sarah scanned the patient's injuries. The stab wounds were deep, and one in particular seemed dangerously close to the liver. Time was not on their side. "He's losing blood fast," Clara reported, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "BP is dropping." Sarah's jaw tightened. She could hear the monitor beeping urgently, each sound marking the passing seconds that the man might not survive. "We need to get him into surgery now. I'll make the first incision." The resident hesitated again. "But Dr. Mitchell, the administration, damn the administration," Sarah snapped, her patience wearing thin. "If we wait for approval, this man will die right here on this table. Now, are you with me or not?" The resident nodded quickly, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah didn't wait for further objections. She signaled to Clara, who handed her the scalpel with practiced precision. The room fell into a tense silence as Sarah made the first incision, the blade cutting cleanly through the man's flesh. The surgery was a race against time. Sarah's hands moved with the speed and accuracy that came from years of experience, each movement deliberate and controlled. She worked to stabilize the patient, to stop the bleeding and repair the damage as best she could. The surgical team followed her lead, the earlier tension replaced by a shared determination to save the man's life. For a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The storm, the hospital, the administrative protocols, none of it mattered. There was only the patient on the table and the task at hand. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of focus, her thoughts racing as she anticipated each step, each potential complication. But doubts began to creep in at the edges of her consciousness. She had been in situations like this before, where a patient's life hung by a thread and every second counted. But tonight felt different, more desperate. Maybe it was the man's fragile state, or the way his injuries seemed to tell a story of violence and abandonment. Or maybe it was the knowledge that by choosing to operate, she was risking not just her job, but her entire career. The thought flickered briefly in her mind, what would happen if she lost this patient? But she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. Clara, more suction, she ordered, her voice clipped. Blood pooled around the wound, obscuring her view. She needed to see, to get to the source of the bleeding. The nurse responded immediately, clearing the area as Sarah carefully maneuvered around the man's liver. The room was filled with the soft, rhythmic hum of machines, punctuated by the occasional sharp intake of breath from the team. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable, a shared sense of urgency that hung heavy in the air. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, Sarah found the source of the bleeding. A nicked artery, dangerously close to the liver. If she hadn't acted when she did, the man wouldn't have stood a chance. Clamp, she called out, and a clamp was placed in her hand. She worked quickly, securing the artery and stopping the flow of blood. The monitor's beeping began to steady, the man's vitals showing signs of stabilization. But Sarah didn't allow herself to relax. The man was still critical, and they weren't out of the woods yet. She moved on to the other wounds, repairing each with the same meticulous care. The minutes ticked by, but eventually, the worst was over. The man was stable, for now. Sarah stepped back, finally allowing herself to take a breath. The exhaustion crashed over her like a wave, but there was also a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done what needed to be done. She had saved a life. But as she looked down at the unconscious man, another thought crossed her mind, a troubling, lingering question. What would happen when the hospital administration found out what she had done? The rules were clear, and she had broken them. She knew there would be consequences. "Good work, everyone," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "Let's get into recovery." As the team moved to transfer the patient, Sarah caught a glimpse of the resident who had questioned her earlier. He looked at her with a mix of admiration and uncertainty, clearly grappling with the events of the night. "Dr. Mitchell," he began, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for earlier. You did the right thing." Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We'll see," she replied, her tone neutral. "For now, let's just focus on getting him through the night." With that, she turned and left the operating room, her mind already racing ahead to what lay beyond the doors. The rain outside had intensified, pounding against the windows as if echoing the storm brewing within the hospital walls. Sarah knew that tonight's battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed in the pale light of dawn. Inside St. Anne's Hospital, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The hallways buzzed with subdued energy, the kind that hinted at brewing trouble. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat alone in the small break room, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. Her eyes were heavy with fatigue, but her mind was sharp, replaying the events of the previous night. She had saved the man, there was no doubt about that. Yet the satisfaction of that victory was overshadowed by the nagging knowledge that she had violated hospital policy. Sarah had been in this line of work long enough to know that there were always consequences for going against the system, even if your intentions were pure. And the hospital board was not known for its leniency. As she stared into the dark liquid in her cup, the door to the break room creaked open, and Nurse Clara slipped inside. She looked tired, but there was a quiet strength in her posture, a reassurance that Sarah had come to rely on over the years. "Morning," Clara said softly, closing the door behind her. "Morning," Sarah replied, her voice low. She glanced up, meeting Clara's gaze. There was no need for pleasantries, they both knew what was coming. Words spreading fast, Clara continued, moving to the counter to pour herself a cup of coffee. "Everyone's talking about what happened last night." Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I figured they would be." Clara turned to face her, cradling her mug in both hands. "You did what you had to do, Sarah. That man would have died if you hadn't operated." "I know," Sarah said, her tone firm but tinged with frustration. "But the board won't see it that way. All they'll care about is that I broke protocol. It doesn't matter that I saved his life." Clara took a seat across from Sarah, studying her for a moment before speaking. "You've always followed your instincts, Sarah. That's what makes you a great surgeon." But this time, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "This time, the risks were higher. You knew that." Sarah nodded slowly. "I did. But I wasn't going to stand by and watch that man die because of some bureaucratic red tape." "I know," Clara said gently. "And I don't think anyone here doubts that you did the right thing. But the board, they have their own rules, and they're going to want answers." As if on cue, Sarah's pager buzzed again, cutting through the tense silence. She glanced at it, already knowing what it would say. "Boardroom, 8 a.m., the message read. Sarah's heart sank, but she pushed the feeling down, replacing it with resolve. She had expected this, prepared for it, even. But that didn't make the prospect of facing the hospital board any less daunting. Clara reached across the table, placing a hand on Sarah's arm. "Whatever happens in there, just remember, you saved a life last night. That's what matters." Sarah offered a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks, Clara." They sat in silence for a moment longer, the weight of the impending meeting heavy in the air. Finally, Sarah stood, straightening her scrubs as she mentally prepared herself for what was to come. "It's time," she said, her voice steady. "Wish me luck." "Good luck," Clara replied, her tone sincere. "And Sarah, don't let them make you doubt yourself." Sarah nodded, then turned and left the break room, the door clicking shut behind her. The walk to the boardroom felt longer than usual, each step echoing in the quiet corridor. She passed a few colleagues along the way, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. They knew where she was headed, and why. But no one spoke a word to her, there was nothing they could say that would change what was about to happen. When she reached the boardroom, Sarah paused outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She had faced difficult surgeries, life-or-death decisions, and the chaos of the emergency room, but this was different. This was about her career, her reputation, and everything she had worked so hard to build. But more than that, it was about standing up for what she believed in. Finally, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital, with its polished wooden table and leather chairs. The members of the hospital board were already seated, their faces a mixture of sternness and mild interest. At the head of the table sat Dr. Robert Sinclair, the hospital's chief administrator, a man known for his rigid adherence to the rules. "Dr. Mitchell," Sinclair greeted her with a nod, his voice devoid of warmth. "Please, have a seat." Sarah complied, sitting at the end of the long table, directly across from Sinclair. The other board members, most of whom she knew only in passing, watched her with keen, impassive eyes. "We've called this meeting to discuss the events of last night," Sinclair began, folding his hands neatly on the table in front of him. "Specifically, your decision to perform emergency surgery on a patient without proper administrative approval." Sarah met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. The patient was in critical condition, Dr. Sinclair. If I hadn't operated when I did, he would have died. Be that as it may, Sinclair continued, his tone measured, hospital policy is clear on this matter. All non-emergency procedures require prior authorization, especially in cases where the patient is uninsured and unidentified. Your decision to bypass this protocol is a serious violation. I understand the policy, Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. But this wasn't a non-emergency procedure. It was a life-saving intervention. I made a judgment call, based on the situation in front of me. Isn't that what we, as doctors, are trained to do? There was a brief silence as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who had always been one of Sarah's mentors, spoke up. Dr. Mitchell, Harper began, her tone more sympathetic, no one is questioning your skills as a surgeon. But this isn't just about the medical decision you made. It's about the larger implications for the hospital. We have protocols in place for a reason. If we start allowing exceptions, where does it end? Sarah turned her attention to Harper, feeling a pang of disappointment. She had always respected Dr. Harper, had looked up to her as a role model. But now, in this moment, Sarah realized that Harper's loyalty to the institution outweighed her support for a fellow doctor. With all due respect, Dr. Harper, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, if those protocols prevent us from saving lives, then maybe they need to be reevaluated. Another board member, a man Sarah didn't recognize, cleared his throat. This isn't about reevaluating protocols, Dr. Mitchell. It's about the fact that you acted without authorization, putting the hospital at risk, legally and financially. What if the patient had died? What if his family decided to sue? The consequences could have been severe. Sarah felt her frustration rising, but she forced herself to stay composed. The patient didn't die. He's stable, thanks to the surgery. And as for legal repercussions, if we're truly concerned about that, maybe we should be more worried about what happens when we let people die because we're too afraid to act. Sinclair leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The fact remains, Dr. Mitchell, that you broke the rules. And there are consequences for that. There it was, the inevitable outcome. Sarah had known this was coming, but hearing it still sent a chill down her spine. She had never been one to shy away from taking responsibility, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. So what happens now? She asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Sinclair exchanged a glance with the other board members before turning back to Sarah. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your duties as head of surgery, pending further review. You'll be notified when the board has reached a final decision regarding your employment. Sarah absorbed the words, her heart sinking. This was worse than she had expected. Suspension meant she was being put under scrutiny, her every action questioned. But more than that, it meant she wouldn't be able to do the one thing she had dedicated her life to, saving lives. Understood, she said quietly, standing up from her chair. Is there anything else? Sinclair shook his head. That will be all, Dr. Mitchell. Without another word, Sarah turned and left the boardroom, the door closing softly behind her. The hallway outside seemed colder, the sterile walls closing in around her as she walked, each step echoing in the silence. She had done what she believed was right, there was no question about that. But now, standing alone in the empty corridor, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had saved a life, but at what cost? And as she made her way back to her office to collect her things, one thought kept repeating in her mind, was it all worth it? The suspension felt like a creeping shadow in the days that followed. Dr. Sarah Mitchell drifted through the hours in a daze, the loss of her routine, a routine that had once been her lifeline, leaving her unmoored. She wasn't sure what to do with herself now that she couldn't operate, couldn't walk the familiar corridors of St. Anne's with a purpose. She avoided the news, knowing that the story of her suspension was likely circulating, that her name was being whispered about in hallways and offices. Sarah spent most of her time at home, staring out the window of her small apartment. The city continued its daily churn below her, oblivious to the turmoil in her life. It was a strange feeling, being disconnected from the world she had always been so deeply embedded in. The hospital had been her whole life, her identity, and now, without it, she felt like she was floating, weightless and directionless. On the fourth day of her suspension, Sarah's phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the thick fog of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, seeing an unfamiliar number. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something, curiosity, perhaps, made her pick it up. "Hello," she answered, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, as if she hadn't used it in days. "Dr. Mitchell?" The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative. "My name is Alan Turner. I'm Richard Caldwell's attorney. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Caldwell." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Richard Caldwell, the man she had saved, the man whose life had turned hers upside down. She had been so consumed by her own situation that she hadn't given much thought to him since that night in the OR. But now, his name brought a rush of memories and a surge of questions. "Mr. Caldwell, how is he?" she asked, her voice suddenly more alert. "He's recovering," Turner replied. "Thanks to your quick actions, he's out of immediate danger, though he's still in a fragile state." Relief washed over Sarah, momentarily lifting the heavy weight on her shoulders. "That's good to hear. I'm glad he's doing better." "Yes, he's very grateful," Turner continued, his tone professional but with a hint of something else, something more urgent. "Which is why he's asked to meet with you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Meet with me? Why?" "Mr. Caldwell wishes to thank you personally," Turner said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He's been informed of your current situation and would like to discuss it with you. He believes he can be of assistance." Assistance. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah wasn't sure what to think. Part of her felt a surge of hope, maybe this could be her way out, a way to reclaim her career, her life. But another part of her was wary. She knew nothing about Richard Caldwell, except for the fact that he had once been a billionaire recluse, a man who had disappeared from public life only to resurface on her operating table. "When does he want to meet?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "As soon as possible," Turner replied. "Mr. Caldwell is still in the hospital, but he's requested a private meeting with you. I can arrange for a car to pick you up and bring you to him, if that's acceptable." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. This was all happening so quickly, and she felt unprepared, unsure of what to expect. But she knew she couldn't turn down the request, not after everything that had happened. "All right," she said finally. "I'll meet with him." "Excellent," Turner said, his tone lightening. "I'll have a car sent to your address this afternoon." "Thank you, Dr. Mitchell." They ended the call, and Sarah found herself staring at the phone in her hand, her thoughts spinning. What did Richard Caldwell want with her? Was this really about gratitude, or was there something more? And most importantly, could this meeting change the course of her life, her career? Later that afternoon, as promised, a sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment building. Sarah hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the city passing by in a blur of colors and lights, as if the world outside was moving faster than usual. When they arrived at St. Anne's, Sarah felt a pang of nostalgia and longing. She had spent so many years here, had poured her heart and soul into this place, and now she was returning not as a surgeon, but as a visitor. The thought unsettled her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Alan Turner was waiting for her at the hospital entrance, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 50s. He greeted her with a polite nod and a firm handshake. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice warm but businesslike. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Mr. Caldwell is eager to see you." Sarah followed Turner through the hospital, her heart beating a little faster with each step. She knew these hallways so well, had walked them countless times, but today they felt different, alien, almost. She wasn't here as a doctor, wasn't here to save anyone. She was here to face the consequences of her actions, whatever they might be. They reached a private room on the top floor, far from the bustle of the main wards. Turner knocked lightly on the door before pushing it open and gesturing for Sarah to enter. Inside, the room was quiet, almost serene. Sunlight streamed in through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden furniture and the soft, white linens of the bed. Richard Caldwell lay propped up against the pillows, his face pale but alert. His eyes, sharp and clear, locked onto Sarah the moment she stepped into the room. "Dr. Mitchell," he greeted her, his voice surprisingly strong given his condition. "Thank you for coming." "Mr. Caldwell," Sarah replied, forcing herself to stay composed as she approached the bed. "I'm glad to see you're recovering." Caldwell smiled faintly, a tired but genuine expression. "Thanks to you, I am." "Please, sit down." Sarah took a seat in the chair beside his bed, feeling an odd sense of disorientation. Here she was, sitting next to a man who was once one of the wealthiest people in the world, a man whose life she had saved without knowing who he was. And now, he was looking at her as if she held all the answers. "I understand you've been suspended from your duties," Caldwell began, his tone careful. "Yes," Sarah admitted, unable to hide the bitterness in her voice. "The hospital board isn't happy with how I handled your case." "Because you saved my life," Caldwell said, his tone more statement than question. Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting his. "They don't see it that way. To them, I broke protocol. And now, I'm paying the price." Caldwell was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "And do you regret it?" Sarah hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on her. Did she regret it? She had asked herself that question countless times since her suspension, and the answer had always been the same. "No," she said firmly. "I don't regret it. I couldn't stand by and do nothing while you were dying. I'm a doctor, that's my job. My responsibility." Caldwell nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "That's what I thought you'd say. Which is why I wanted to meet you, Dr. Mitchell." Sarah frowned slightly, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" "I've spent most of my life in business," Caldwell began, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "I've seen how people can be swayed by power, by money, by the fear of losing what they have. But you acted on principle. You risked everything to save a life, not knowing who I was, not caring about the consequences." Sarah shifted in her seat, feeling uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "I was just doing what I thought was right. And that," Caldwell said, his gaze intense, "is exactly why I want to help you." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Help me? How?" "I'm not just a man with money, Dr. Mitchell," Caldwell continued, his tone growing more determined. "I have influence, connections. I can help you get your job back, clear your name. But more than that, I want to work with you. I want to create something that will make a real difference in the world." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This was more than she had ever imagined, more than she could have hoped for. But it also felt overwhelming, almost too good to be true. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I want to create a foundation," Caldwell explained, his eyes bright with purpose. "A foundation that provides medical care to those who can't afford it, who are turned away by places like this because of bureaucracy and greed. And I want you to help me lead it." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. A foundation, a way to help people, to make a difference on a larger scale than she ever could as a surgeon alone. It was an incredible opportunity, one that could change her life, and the lives of countless others. But it was also a huge responsibility, one that came with its own set of challenges and risks. She looked at Caldwell, seeing the determination in his eyes, the fire of someone who had been given a second chance at life and wanted to make the most of it. And in that moment, Sarah felt something shift inside her, something that told her this was the path she was meant to take. I don't know what to say, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Caldwell smiled, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to lighten the room. Just say yes, Dr. Mitchell. And let's change the world together. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding. This was it, the turning point she hadn't seen coming. And as she looked into Richard Caldwell's eyes, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Let's do it. The days that followed Sarah's decision to partner with Richard Caldwell felt like stepping into a whirlwind. What had begun as a simple act of defiance against hospital policy had spiraled into something much larger, an opportunity that held the promise of real, tangible change. But with that opportunity came a weight of responsibility that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The hospital, once her entire world, now felt like a distant memory as she plunged headfirst into this new chapter of her life. Richard Caldwell's recovery progressed steadily, and as he grew stronger, so did the plans for the foundation. They met regularly in his private room at St. Anne's, the sterile hospital environment contrasting sharply with the vibrant, passionate discussions they had about the future. Sarah found herself energized by the possibilities, the chance to do something meaningful on a scale she had never imagined. But underneath it all, a persistent unease lingered, a reminder that the world she had known wasn't quite ready to let her go. One afternoon, as she was preparing to leave Caldwell's room, he stopped her with a question that had been on his mind for days. Sarah, he began, his tone serious, have you thought about what this foundation will mean for your career? Sarah paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. What do you mean? Caldwell shifted in his bed, sitting up straighter. His recovery had brought back some of the vigor he had once been known for, the sharpness in his eyes hinting at the formidable businessman he had been. Once we go public with this, there's no going back. The hospital board, your colleagues, they're not going to see this as just another project. It's a direct challenge to the system they've built their careers on. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words. I've thought about it, she admitted. I know there will be pushback, but I can't keep working within a system that prioritizes profits over people. This foundation, it's a chance to do things differently. Caldwell studied her for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod. Good. Because this is going to be a fight, Sarah. You need to be prepared for that. Sarah met his gaze, her resolve hardening. I am. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Caldwell worked tirelessly to lay the groundwork for the foundation. They brought in legal advisors, drafted mission statements, and began reaching out to potential partners and donors. The more they worked, the more Sarah felt a sense of purpose returning to her life, a purpose that had been missing since her suspension. But as the foundation began to take shape, so too did the challenges that Caldwell had warned her about. One morning, Sarah received an unexpected call from Dr. Elizabeth Harper. They hadn't spoken since the board meeting where Sarah's suspension had been announced, and hearing Harper's voice brought back a rush of conflicting emotions, respect, disappointment, and a lingering sense of betrayal. Sarah, it's Elizabeth, Harper said, her tone measured. I think we need to talk. About what? Sarah asked, though she had a feeling she already knew. About your recent activities, Harper replied. I've heard you've been working with Richard Caldwell on some kind of foundation. Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, that's true. We're creating a foundation to provide medical care for those who can't afford it. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for Sarah to feel the tension building. Finally, Harper spoke again, her voice tinged with concern. Sarah, I understand that you're passionate about this, but you need to think carefully about what you're doing. This could have serious consequences, for you, for your career. I've already faced the consequences, Sarah said, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. I was suspended because I chose to save a man's life. I'm not going to stop now just because it makes some people uncomfortable. Sarah, listen to me, Harper insisted, her tone softening. I'm not your enemy. I've always admired your dedication, your skill as a surgeon. But you're going up against the hospital, against the very system that trained you. If you continue down this path, you might find yourself completely shut out." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew that Harper meant well, that she was trying to protect her. But Sarah had already made her decision. There was no turning back now. "I appreciate your concern, Elizabeth," she said calmly. "But I can't keep playing by their rules. If that means I have to find a new path, then so be it." There was another long silence, and when Harper spoke again, her voice was tinged with sadness. "I just don't want to see you lose everything you've worked so hard for." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice firm as she replied, "I'm not losing anything, Elizabeth. I'm gaining something new. And I hope, one day, you'll see that too." They ended the call on a polite but distant note, and as Sarah put down the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed another invisible line, one that separated her from the life she had once known. The conversation with Harper had been a reminder that the world she was leaving behind wasn't going to let go without a fight. A few days later, Sarah was called into a meeting with the hospital board. She had expected this. Her activities with the foundation had not gone unnoticed, and she knew that the board would want to confront her. When she entered the boardroom, she was met with the same stern faces that had greeted her the day of her suspension. Dr. Robert Sinclair, the hospital's chief administrator, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Mitchell," Sinclair began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we've been hearing some troubling reports about your recent actions. Specifically, your involvement with Richard Caldwell's foundation." Sarah took a seat, her posture straight and composed. "Yes, I've been working with Mr. Caldwell to establish a foundation that will provide medical care to those who can't afford it." Sinclair leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. "And do you understand the implications of that work, Dr. Mitchell? The potential conflicts it creates with your role here at St. Anne's?" Sarah met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I understand that this foundation represents a different approach to healthcare, one that challenges the way things are done here. But I believe it's necessary." Sinclair's expression hardened. "Necessary? Or idealistic? You're risking your career for something that could very well fail, Dr. Mitchell. The hospital board cannot support this venture, and we cannot allow one of our own to undermine the integrity of our institution." Sarah felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she kept her voice steady. "With all due respect, Dr. Sinclair, the integrity of this institution is exactly what I'm challenging. We've become too focused on policies, on profits, and we're losing sight of what really matters, our patients." A murmur ran through the board members, some exchanging glances, others frowning. Sinclair's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "You're entitled to your opinion, Dr. Mitchell. But as of today, you are no longer employed by St. Anne's Hospital. Your suspension is now a termination." The words hit Sarah like a blow, but she didn't flinch. She had expected this, prepared for it, and now that it was happening, she felt an odd sense of relief. There was no more ambiguity, no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was done. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve here," Sarah said, her voice calm and resolute. "I'll be sure to collect my things." She stood and left the room without another word, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked down the corridor for what she knew would be the last time, she felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness for what she was leaving behind, but also a deep, unshakable sense of purpose for what lay ahead. When Sarah returned to Richard Caldwell's room later that day, she found him sitting up, a newspaper spread out on his lap. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression made him set the paper aside. "What happened?" he asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. "I'm no longer employed at St. Anne's," Sarah said simply, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Caldwell nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Sarah." But she shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Don't be. It was time. And now we can really get started." Caldwell studied her for a moment, then returned her smile. "Yes. Now we can." As Sarah sat down to continue planning the future of their foundation, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. This was her turning point, the moment where she let go of the past and fully embraced the uncertain, exhilarating future that lay ahead. Whatever challenges came next, she knew she was ready to face them head-on. The weeks that followed Sarah Mitchell's departure from St. Anne's Hospital were a blur of activity, meetings, and late-night planning sessions. Richard Caldwell's foundation was no longer just an idea, it was becoming a reality, one that would soon make its mark on the world. The Foundation for Equitable Healthcare, as they decided to name it, was set to provide medical care to those who had been forgotten by the system, those who had fallen through the cracks. But as the foundation grew, so did the challenges. The media had caught wind of the story, and the spotlight was now firmly on Sarah and Caldwell. Reports ranged from admiring profiles of Sarah's courage to skeptical pieces questioning the foundation's viability. Some even painted Sarah as a reckless idealist, someone who had turned her back on the established medical community. It was a harsh, unrelenting scrutiny, and Sarah found herself constantly under pressure. One evening, as she sat in a small office they had set up in a converted warehouse, Sarah stared at the piles of paperwork in front of her. The excitement of the foundation's early days had given way to the grinding reality of building something from the ground up. She felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, every decision, every setback, every criticism. Richard Caldwell, now fully recovered, walked into the office, his presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone in this. He had been her constant support, a steady hand guiding the foundation's development. But tonight, as he entered the room, he could see the strain on her face. "Long day?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Sarah looked up, managing a tired smile. "You could say that. It's just, there's so much to do, and I keep wondering if we're really making a difference. The more we push forward, the more resistance we face." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Change is never easy, Sarah. Especially when it challenges the status quo. But that's why it's worth it. You knew this wouldn't be simple." "I did," Sarah agreed, her voice quiet. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm cut out for this. I'm a surgeon, Richard. I know how to fix things in the OR, but this is different." Caldwell smiled gently, his gaze steady. "You're more than just a surgeon, Sarah. You're a leader, and that's what this foundation needs. It needs someone who understands what's at stake, someone who isn't afraid to fight for what's right." Sarah felt a swell of emotion at his words, but she still couldn't shake the doubts gnawing at her. "What if we fail?" she asked, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. Caldwell reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "Then we'll fail knowing we tried to do something good, something that mattered. But I don't believe we will fail, Sarah. Not with you leading the way." His words, filled with quiet conviction, gave her the strength she needed. Sarah squeezed his hand, a renewed determination settling in her chest. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice stronger now. "I needed to hear that." As the days passed, the foundation began to take on a life of its own. They held their first press conference, announcing their mission to the world. Sarah stood at the podium, her heart pounding as she addressed the room full of reporters, cameras flashing and pens scribbling furiously. She spoke about the need for accessible healthcare, about the people who were suffering because the system had failed them. She shared her vision for a future where no one would be turned away from the care they needed. The reaction was immediate and powerful. Donations started pouring in, from both individuals and organizations that believed in the cause. Sarah could hardly believe it, people were listening, they were responding. The foundation was no longer just an idea, it was a movement. But with the success came the inevitable backlash. The hospital board at St. Anne's released a statement condemning the foundation's mission as unrealistic and potentially dangerous. They accused Sarah of undermining the work of established medical institutions, of creating false hope for those the foundation aimed to help. It was a harsh rebuke, one that stung more than Sarah wanted to admit. She knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. The board's words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the life she had left behind. But every time she felt doubt creeping in, she thought of the people they were helping, the patients who had already begun to receive care through the Foundation's initial programs. They were the reason she had chosen this path, and she couldn't afford to lose sight of that. Then, one evening, as she was leaving the Foundation's office, Sarah's phone buzzed with a call. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but something urged her to pick it up. "Dr. Mitchell," a voice asked on the other end, familiar and formal. "This is Sarah Mitchell," she replied, her tone cautious. "This is Elizabeth Harper," the voice continued, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't spoken to Dr. Harper since their last tense conversation, and she wasn't sure what to expect now. "Elizabeth," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about the Foundation," Harper said, her tone surprisingly neutral. "I've been following what you're doing, and I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Sarah's mind raced. Was this another attempt to dissuade her, or was there something more behind Harper's words? "Of course," she said, her curiosity piqued. "When would you like to meet?" "Tonight, if you're available," Harper suggested. "There's a small cafe near the hospital, the Blue Lantern. Can you be there in an hour?" Sarah agreed, and an hour later, she found herself sitting across from Harper in a quiet corner of the cafe. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the tension that had marked their last conversation. Harper looked tired, as if the weight of recent events had taken a toll on her as well. "Thank you for meeting with me, Sarah," Harper began, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the last time we spoke." Sarah nodded, unsure of where this was leading. "I've been thinking about it too." Harper took a deep breath, then continued. "I was wrong to try to stop you. At the time, I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was just afraid of what change would mean for all of us. But seeing what you've accomplished, it's made me realize that maybe the system does need to change." Sarah felt a flicker of hope at Harper's words. "Elizabeth, I never wanted to turn my back on the hospital. But I couldn't stand by and do nothing while people suffered." "I know," Harper said, her gaze earnest. "And that's why I'm here. I want to help. I want to be a part of this, if you'll have me." The offer took Sarah by surprise. She had never expected this, the chance to work alongside someone she had once looked up to, someone who understood the system as deeply as Harper did. It was an opportunity to bring their two worlds together, to create something even more powerful. "I would be honored," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Elizabeth." Harper smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "No, Sarah. Thank you for showing me that there's another way." As they left the cafe together, a sense of peace settled over Sarah. The road ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges. But for the first time, she felt truly ready to face it. She wasn't alone in this fight, not anymore. The following week, the Foundation held its official launch event. The room was filled with supporters, donors, and members of the press. Sarah stood at the center of it all, surrounded by the people who had made this dream possible, Caldwell, Harper, and the team they had built together. As she looked out over the crowd, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what she had been working toward, what she had sacrificed so much for. And as she took the stage to speak, she knew that this was only the beginning. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady and confident. "The Foundation for Equitable Healthcare is more than just an organization, it's a commitment to the belief that everyone deserves access to quality care, regardless of their circumstances. Together, we can make that belief a reality." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt a surge of pride and hope. The Foundation had started as a response to a broken system, but it had become so much more. It was a beacon of change, a symbol of what could be accomplished when people came together with a shared purpose. As the event continued, Sarah found a moment to step outside, needing a breath of fresh air. The evening was cool, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She stood there for a moment, letting the reality of what they had achieved sink in. Richard Caldwell joined her a few minutes later, his presence a comforting reminder of how far they had come. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle. Sarah turned to him, a smile spreading across her face. "I feel at peace," she said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Caldwell smiled back, a look of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that, Sarah. You've earned it." They stood there together, looking out at the city, the night filled with the promise of a new beginning. The foundation was just the start, a step toward a future where healthcare was a right, not a privilege. And Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, knowing she wasn't alone. In that moment, as the world seemed to hold its breath, Sarah Mitchell found the redemption she had been searching for, not in the approval of others, but in the knowledge that she was making a difference. And that, more than anything else, was what made the journey worthwhile.